They declared her sterile, but a Mafia boss made her a mother of 4 children. The cold March wind cut through Chicago's streets like a sharp blade, making Isabella Martinez pull her coat tighter against her body as she hurried down Michigan Avenue. At 28, she had grown accustomed to the city's brutal winters, but on this Tuesday morning, the cold seemed to penetrate deeper into her bones, as if sensing that her life was about to change forever. Northwestern Memorial Hospital rose before her like a fortress of glass and steel, its windows reflecting the gray sky that threatened snow. Isabella had worked there for 5 years as a nurse in the emergency department, but today, she wasn't going for another shift. Today, she was the patient. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the anxiety that had consumed her for weeks. Since the car accident 3 months ago, when a drunk driver collided with her Honda Civic on Lakeshore Drive, her life had become a succession of medical appointments, tests, and procedures. What began as apparently minor injuries had revealed internal complications that doctors were still trying to fully understand. Isabella Martinez for Dr. Richardson, Office 412, announced the receptionist in a monotone voice that echoed through the hospital lobby. Isabella took a deep breath, smelling the familiar scent of disinfectant and the controlled bustle that characterized the hospital environment. Even being a nurse, being on the other side of the medical equation made her uncomfortable. The elevator slowly climbed to the 4th floor, each second seeming like an eternity. Isabella watched the numbers changing on the digital display, trying to control her breathing. She had seen many patients receive difficult news throughout her career, but never imagined she would one day be in the same position. Dr. Richardson's office was Spartan, with white walls decorated only with medical diplomas and certifications. The doctor, a man in his early 50s with graying hair and gold-rimmed glasses, sat behind his desk, leafing through a medical chart that Isabella recognized as her own. "Isabella, please sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair in front of the desk. His voice was gentle, but there was something in his tone that made her stomach contract. "I received the results of your latest tests." She settled into the chair, her hands clasped in her lap. "So, doctor, will the abdominal pain go away? Is it just a matter of time to fully recover from the accident?" "Doctor." Richardson removed his glasses and cleaned them carefully, a gesture that Isabella had learned to recognize as a sign that bad news was coming. During her years as a nurse, she had seen doctors do exactly the same thing before difficult conversations with families. "Isabella, I need to be direct with you," he began, putting his glasses back on. "The trauma you suffered in the accident caused significant damage to your reproductive system. Specifically, there were injuries to the fallopian tubes and scarring in the uterus that make pregnancy extremely unlikely." The words seemed to echo in the office, each syllable reverberating in Isabella's mind like waves on a calm lake. She blinked several times, trying to process what she had just heard. "Unlikely," she repeated, her voice coming out as a whisper. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means that based on the tests and the extent of the damage, the probability of you getting pregnant naturally is less than 2%, explained the doctor, his voice maintaining a professional tone, but with a touch of compassion. Even with fertility treatments, the chances would be minimal due to the nature of the injuries. Isabella felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Since childhood, she had dreamed of being a mother. She grew up in a large, close-knit Mexican-American family in the Pilsen neighborhood, where children ran through the streets and the sound of children's laughter was constant. She had always imagined that one day she would have her own house, full of small voices and hurried footsteps. "But I'm young," she said, her voice beginning to fail. "I'm only 28. I've always been healthy. How can this be happening?" Dr. Richardson leaned forward, his hands crossed on the desk. "Sometimes, Isabella, life presents us with challenges we cannot predict or control. The trauma you suffered was significant. The fact that you survived the accident is in itself a miracle." Tears began to form in Isabella's eyes, blurring her vision. She tried to remain composed. After all, she was a healthcare professional and was used to dealing with difficult situations. But this was different. This was personal, intimate, devastating. There are other options, continued the doctor. Adoption, for example, or you could consider— I need time, interrupted Isabella, standing abruptly from the chair. I need to process this. She left the office in a state of shock, walking through the hospital corridors as if in a dream. Work colleagues greeted her, but she could barely respond. Everything seemed distant, unreal. Chicago's cold hit her again when she left the hospital, but this time she barely felt it. She walked aimlessly through downtown streets, passing skyscrapers that rose like concrete and glass giants around her. The city continued its frantic routine, cars honking, people hurrying on sidewalks, the constant noise of urban life. But for Isabella, everything had stopped. She found herself in Millennium Park, sitting on a bench in front of Cloud Gate, the famous mirrored sculpture that locals called the Beam. Even in the March cold, there were tourists taking photos, children running around the sculpture, families enjoying the day. The irony was not lost on her. Her phone vibrated, a message from her younger sister, Carmen. How was the appointment? I hope it's good news. Isabella looked at the screen, the words blurred by tears that finally began to fall freely. How could she explain? How could she tell her family, who had always expected her to be the first to give grandchildren to their parents, that this dream had been destroyed in a split second by an irresponsible driver? The wind blew stronger, carrying with it dry leaves from the previous autumn that had survived the winter. Isabella watched them dance in the air, thinking about how life could change so quickly, so drastically. 3 months ago, she was a young nurse with plans for the future, maybe even thinking about starting to date seriously again after the end of a long relationship. Now, she felt as if a fundamental part of her identity had been torn from her. Hours passed before she finally got up from the bench. The sun was beginning to set, painting Chicago's sky with shades of orange and pink that contrasted with winter's coldness. She knew she needed to go home, face reality, maybe call Carmen and tell the truth. But as she walked back to her apartment in Lincoln Park, Isabella couldn't imagine that her life was about to take a completely unexpected direction. That in a few months, she would meet someone who would challenge not only her expectations about love, but also the medical certainties she had received on that devastating day. The sterility diagnosis seemed final, definitive, a sentence that forever closed the door to her dreams of motherhood. But fate, as Isabella would soon discover, had other plans for her. Plans that would involve passion, danger, and miracles that medicine couldn't explain. As the city lights began to turn on, creating a bright mosaic against the darkening sky, Isabella Martinez walked home, carrying the weight of a future she believed was lost forever. She didn't know she was about to embark on a journey that would test all her limits, question all her beliefs, and ultimately give her everything she had always dreamed of, in a way she could never have imagined. Night fell over Chicago, and with it, the first chapter of a story that would challenge probabilities, medicine, and Isabella's own notions of what was possible when true love finds its way through the most unlikely circumstances. 3 months had passed since the devastating diagnosis, and Isabella had developed a melancholic routine that helped her navigate the days. Work at the hospital during the day, solitary walks through the city at dusk, and nights at home watching medical series that ironically made her feel less alone. She had told her family about her condition, facing her mother's tears and her father's heavy silence, who didn't know how to comfort her. It was a Friday in June when everything changed. Summer had finally arrived in Chicago, bringing with it the humid heat that made the city pulse with different energy. People went out more, restaurants extended their tables to sidewalks, and there was a general sense of renewal in the air. Isabella had finished a particularly difficult shift in the emergency room. 3 car accidents, an overdose, and a fight that resulted in serious injuries. At 28, she had already seen everything, but some days were heavier than others. Walking down Rush Street, she decided to do something she hadn't done in months: enter a bar for a drink. Rossi's was a traditional Italian establishment in River North, known for its authenticity and discreet clientele. Isabella had passed by it hundreds of times, but had never entered. That night, something attracted her. Maybe it was the soft music escaping through the half-open door, or the warm, welcoming golden light that contrasted with the aggressive neon of other bars on the street. The interior was exactly as she had imagined. Dark wood, bronze fixtures, and the rich aroma of Italian spices mixed with the smell of red wine. There were about 20 people scattered throughout the place, most in small groups talking in low tones. Isabella chose a spot at the bar, ordered a Chianti, and tried to relax for the first time in weeks. "Rough night?" asked a deep voice beside her. Isabella turned and encountered the most intense eyes she had ever seen. The man next to her was about 35 years old, with dark hair slicked back, and wore a perfectly tailored gray suit that probably cost more than she earned in a month. But it wasn't his impeccable appearance that impressed her. It was the way he looked at her, as if he could see through all the defenses she had built in recent months. "Excuse me," she said, trying to maintain the professional composure she had perfected over the years. "You have the look of someone who's had a difficult day," he explained, gesturing to the bartender. "Tony, another Macallan 18, and whatever the lady is drinking." "You don't need to," protested Isabella. "I can pay for my own drink." He smiled, and Isabella felt something move in her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced in a long time. "I'm sure you can, but accept it as a gesture from someone who recognizes a tired soul when he sees one." There was something in his voice, a slight accent that suggested Italian origins, but softened by years living in Chicago. Isabella studied his face, noticing a small scar near his left temple, and the way his eyes seemed to carry stories she couldn't decipher. "Vincent Romano," he said, extending his hand. "Isabella Martinez," she replied, shaking his hand and noticing the firmness of his grip, the calluses that suggested he wasn't just an ordinary businessman. "Martinez? Mexican family?" asked Vincent, genuinely interested. "Mexican-American. My parents came from Guadalajara in the 80s, explained Isabella, surprised by her own openness. Normally, she was more reserved with strangers. "My family came from Naples around the same time," said Vincent. "Funny how Chicago became home to so many of us who came from other places." They talked for 2 hours. Vincent was intelligent, funny, and showed genuine interest in her life. He said he worked with family business, a vague description that Isabella noted but didn't question. She talked about her work as a nurse, carefully avoiding the subject of her medical condition. "You save lives," said Vincent, his voice loaded with admiration. That's something special, Isabella." "Sometimes," she replied, taking a sip of wine. "Sometimes we just try to fix what's broken." Vincent studied her for a moment as if he could sense the pain behind her words. "And who fixes you when you're broken?" The question caught her off guard. Isabella felt tears threatening to form and quickly looked away. "Sorry, I don't usually talk about personal things with strangers." "We're not strangers anymore," said Vincent softly, "and you don't have to carry everything alone." There was something in his voice, an understanding that went beyond superficial sympathy. Isabella looked at him again, seeing something in his eyes that made her want to trust, want to open up in a way she hadn't in months. "I received some difficult medical news recently," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It changed everything I thought about my future." Vincent didn't press for details. Instead, he simply nodded, as if understanding that some pains were too big to be shared immediately. "The future has a funny way of surprising us," he said. "Sometimes when we think everything is lost, life presents us with possibilities we never imagined." They were interrupted by a tall, thin man who approached the table. "Mr. Romano," he said in a low voice, "sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation that requires your attention." Isabella noticed the immediate change in Vincent's posture. His shoulders stiffened slightly, and his eyes acquired an intensity that wasn't there moments before. "Marco, can you wait 5 minutes?" "Of course, sir," replied the man, moving away but staying nearby. Vincent turned to Isabella, and she could see a conflict in his eyes. "I need to go," he said, clearly reluctant. "But I would very much like to see you again." Isabella hesitated. There was something about Vincent that intrigued and attracted her, but also something that made her cautious. The way the other man had addressed him, the deference in his voice, suggested that Vincent Romano was not just an ordinary businessman. "I don't know," she said honestly. "You seem complicated." Vincent laughed, a rich sound that echoed through the bar. "We're all complicated, Isabella. The question is whether it's worth discovering someone's complications." He took a card from his pocket. Expensive paper, gold embossed letters, just a name and a phone number. "Think about it," he said, placing the card on the table between them. "If you decide it's worth it, call me." Vincent stood up, left some bills on the table, much more than necessary to pay for the drinks, and leaned down to kiss Isabella's hand. The gesture should have seemed old-fashioned, but somehow it seemed perfectly natural coming from him. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Isabella Martinez," he said, his eyes meeting hers one last time. "I hope our paths cross again." Isabella watched him leave, noticing how other bar patrons greeted him respectfully, how the bartender waved with deference, how even the atmosphere of the place seemed to change slightly with his presence. She picked up the card, feeling the weight of the paper between her fingers. On the way home, Isabella couldn't get Vincent out of her head. There was something magnetic about him, a combination of charm, mystery, and an underlying intensity that fascinated her. But there were also warning signs that her rational mind couldn't ignore. The way people reacted to him, the vagueness about his work, the urgent interruption that had ended their conversation. In her Lincoln Park apartment, Isabella sat on the balcony overlooking Lake Michigan, the cards still in her hands. The night breeze carried the smell of water and the promise of storm. She thought about her life in recent months, the predictable routine, the constant pain of loss, the feeling that her future had been defined by a medical diagnosis. Vincent had awakened something in her that she thought was dead. For the first time since the accident, she had felt seen, understood, desired. But would it be wise to get involved with someone who clearly lived in a different world from hers? Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Carmen, her sister. "Isa, how are you? We haven't talked in days." "I'm fine," replied Isabella, still looking at the card. "Actually, something interesting happened today." "Tell me everything." Isabella hesitated, then decided to share. "I met someone, a man named Vincent." "Really? Tell me more. What's he like?" "He's different, intelligent, charming. But there's something about him I can't figure out. Something that tells me he's not just an ordinary businessman." "Sometimes the best relationships start with a little mystery," said Carmen. "After everything you've been through, maybe it's time to allow yourself something new, something unexpected." After hanging up the phone, Isabella continued sitting on the balcony, watching the city lights reflect on the dark water of the lake. She thought about Vincent's words about the future, having a funny way of surprising us, about possibilities we never imagined. Maybe it was time to stop living in fear. Maybe it was time to discover what kind of complications Vincent Romano brought with him. After all, her life had already been turned upside down. What else could happen? Isabella looked at the card one last time before going inside. Tomorrow she would decide whether to call him. But deep down, she already knew what her choice would be. Something about Vincent had awakened a part of her that she thought was lost forever, and she was too curious to let this opportunity pass. Chicago's night stretched before her, full of possibilities she hadn't considered in months. And for the first time since the diagnosis, Isabella Martinez allowed herself to dream of a future that could be different from everything she had imagined. Isabella spent the entire Saturday looking at Vincent's card. She placed it on the kitchen table during breakfast, carried it to the living room while watching TV, and kept it on the nightstand when she tried to read before sleep. The expensive paper seemed to pulse with unexplored possibilities, as if it contained secrets she was both eager and afraid to discover. Sunday arrived with a typical Chicago summer storm. Lightning cut through the dark sky over Lake Michigan, and the sound of rain against the windows created a melancholic soundtrack for her thoughts. Isabella had worked the morning shift at the hospital and was now at home, still wearing her nurse uniform, holding the card for the 100th time. "What the hell?" she murmured to herself, picking up the phone. The number rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Vincent Romano. Vincent, it's Isabella. Isabella Martinez." We met at Rossi's on Friday. There was a pause, and she could hear the smile in his voice when he replied. Isabella, I was hoping for your call, but starting to think maybe I'd been too presumptuous. You almost were, she admitted, feeling strangely comfortable with her honesty. I'm still not sure if this is a good idea. The best things in life are rarely good ideas on paper, said Vincent. How about we find out together? Are you free for dinner tonight? Isabella looked out the window at the storm outside. It's raining very hard. I'll send a car to pick you up. At 8? She hesitated for a moment, thinking of all the reasons why she should say no. But then she remembered how she felt when they talked at the bar. Alive, interested, as if she were more than just a woman with a devastating medical diagnosis. All right, she said. But somewhere public? Vincent laughed. Of course. I know a place I think you'll like. At 8 o'clock sharp, a black Mercedes stopped in front of Isabella's building. The driver, a middle-aged man in an impeccable suit, got out and opened the rear door for her. Isabella had never experienced this kind of treatment and felt simultaneously impressed and uncomfortable. The restaurant was Alinea, one of Chicago's most exclusive establishments. Isabella had heard of it. It was famous for its molecular cuisine and months-long waiting list. When they arrived, they were immediately escorted to a private table, without any mention of reservation or waiting. How did you get a table here on short notice? Asked Isabella, impressed despite herself. Vincent shrugged as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I have some contacts in the city. During dinner, Isabella discovered more about Vincent. He had grown up in Chicago's Italian neighborhood, Little Italy, son of immigrants who came to America seeking a better life. His family had been in the import and export business for 3 generations, a description he offered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And you? Asked Vincent, delicately cutting a piece of duck confit. How did a girl from Pilsen end up saving lives at Northwestern? Isabella told her story. How she had worked hard in school, gotten a scholarship to Northwestern University, and graduated in nursing with honors. She talked about her family, about how her parents had sacrificed everything to give her and Carmen opportunities they never had. You're impressive, said Vincent, and there was something in his voice that made Isabella believe he really thought so. Building a career, helping people, that requires a strength not everyone has. Sometimes I don't feel strong, admitted Isabella, surprising herself with her own vulnerability. Sometimes I feel like I'm just trying to keep everything together. Vincent leaned forward, his intense eyes fixed on hers. Strength isn't about never breaking, Isabella. It's about rebuilding yourself every time it happens. There was something in his words that suggested personal experience with rebuilding, with breaking and putting oneself back together. Isabella wanted to ask more, but something in his expression made her hesitate. After dinner, Vincent suggested a walk. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and fresh. They walked down the magnificent mile, the city lights reflecting in puddles on the sidewalks. Can I ask a personal question? Said Vincent as they stopped in front of the Crown Fountain in Millennium Park. Isabella nodded, though her stomach contracted slightly. On Friday, you mentioned difficult medical news. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but are you okay? Physically, I mean? Isabella looked at the water dancing in the fountain, illuminated by colored lights. She had avoided this subject during the entire dinner, but something about the way Vincent asked, with genuine concern, without morbid curiosity, made her want to be honest. I had a car accident a few months ago, she began slowly. The injuries caused complications. The doctors told me I'll never be able to have children. Vincent stopped walking. When Isabella looked at him, she saw something in his eyes she couldn't identify. Compassion, anger, determination. I'm sorry, he said, his voice loaded with genuine emotion. That must have been devastating. It was, admitted Isabella, feeling tears threatening to form. I always wanted to be a mother. It was part of who I thought I was, of my future. And now, Vincent turned to face her completely, his hands gently holding her arms. Isabella, look at me. She raised her eyes to meet his. The doctors could be wrong, he said with an intensity that surprised her. I've seen miracles happen when we least expect them. Don't give up on your dreams yet. Vincent, you don't understand. The tests were conclusive. The chances are less than 2%. 2% is still a chance, he insisted. And sometimes, when we find the right person, when true love enters our lives, impossible things become possible. There was something in his voice, a conviction that went beyond casual optimism. Isabella wondered if he knew something she didn't, if there was a reason for his certainty. "Why do you care?" she asked softly. "You barely know me." Vincent hesitated for a moment, as if struggling with something internal. "Because since the moment I saw you at Rossi's, I felt something I've never felt before, as if you were the missing piece in my life." He leaned in and kissed her softly. It was a tender kiss, full of promise and possibility. Isabella felt something move in her chest, a feeling of hope she hadn't experienced in months. When they separated, Vincent smiled at her. "Let me take you home." During the ride back, Isabella couldn't stop thinking about his words. There was something about Vincent that made her want to believe in miracles, in possibilities that medicine had dismissed. But there was also a voice in her head warning her about getting involved too quickly, about trusting someone who clearly had secrets. When they arrived at her building, Vincent got out of the car to walk her to the door. "Would you like to see me again?" he asked. Isabella looked into his eyes, seeing in them a vulnerability he had kept hidden throughout the night. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with her own certainty. "But Vincent, I need to know what I'm getting into. Your work, your life. There are things you're not telling me." Vincent nodded slowly. "You're right. And when we're ready, when we trust each other completely, I'll tell you everything. But for now, I can only promise that I would never do anything to hurt you." Isabella studied his face, looking for signs of dishonesty. All she saw was sincerity and something that looked very much like budding love. "All right," she said finally, "but let's take it slow." Vincent smiled, kissed her hand again, and waited until she was safely inside the building before leaving. That night, Isabella stayed awake for hours, staring at her bedroom ceiling. Her life had become a series of predictable routines since the diagnosis, but Vincent had introduced an element of unpredictability that was both exciting and frightening. She thought about his words, about miracles, about impossible things becoming possible. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as excessive romanticism, but another part, a part that had been asleep for months, was beginning to awaken with hope. Isabella didn't know that Vincent had spent the entire night awake too, making calls to contacts at private hospitals, researching the best fertility specialists in the country. She didn't know that he had decided that very night that he would do everything in his power to give her the children she so desired. And she certainly didn't know that Vincent Romano was much more than a simple businessman, that he was, in fact, one of the most powerful and dangerous men in Chicago, capable of moving mountains when it came to protecting and caring for those he loved. But all of this she would discover soon. For now she was content to fall asleep, with the taste of his kiss still on her lips, and the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. 3 weeks had passed since Isabella and Vincent's first meeting, and they had seen each other almost every day. Vincent took her to dinners at exclusive restaurants, walks through Lincoln Park Zoo, and even to a Chicago Symphony Orchestra concert. Isabella began to get used to the luxury that surrounded Vincent. Expensive cars, VIP treatment wherever they went, and the way people seemed to know and respect him throughout the city. But it was on a rainy Tuesday in July that Isabella finally began to understand who Vincent really was. She was leaving the hospital after a particularly exhausting 12-hour shift when she saw Vincent waiting for her in the parking lot. This wasn't unusual. He often surprised her after work. But this time, there was something different in his posture, a tension she hadn't seen before. "Vincent, is everything okay?" she asked, approaching him. "Get in the car, Isabella. Now," he said, his voice low but urgent. Isabella hesitated. "What's happening?" "Please," insisted Vincent, looking around the parking lot. "I'll explain on the way." Reluctantly, Isabella got into the Mercedes. Vincent gave quick instructions to the driver in Italian, and they left the parking lot at high speed. "Vincent, you're scaring me," said Isabella, noticing how he constantly checked the rear-view mirrors. "There was a problem with my business today," he explained, choosing his words carefully. "Some people might try to use you to get to me. I need you to stay in a safe place for a few days." What kind of problem? What kind of business do you have that would put someone in danger? Vincent looked at her and Isabella saw a conflict in his eyes. Isabella, there are things about my life I haven't told you. Things that might change the way you see me. The car stopped in front of an elegant building in Gold Coast that Isabella didn't recognize. Vincent quickly guided her through the luxurious lobby to a private elevator that required a special key. The penthouse apartment was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, designer furniture, and artwork that seemed to belong in a museum. But Isabella barely noticed the decoration. Her attention was focused on Vincent, who seemed to be struggling with something internal. "Vincent, tell me what's happening," she demanded. He poured himself a whiskey from an expensive bottle and offered one to her, which she refused. "My family. Our business isn't exactly conventional," he began. "What does that mean?" Vincent took a sip of whiskey, as if needing courage. "It means we're part of an organization that operates outside traditional law. We have our own codes, our own rules." Isabella felt her blood freeze. "Are you saying you're part of the Mafia?" "That's a word we don't use," said Vincent carefully. "But yes, my family is involved in activities the government considers illegal." Isabella stood up abruptly, starting to pace back and forth. "My God, Vincent, you're a criminal." "I'm a man who protects his family and his community," he replied, his voice becoming firmer. "Yes, sometimes that means breaking laws we consider unjust. But I never hurt innocents, Isabella. Never." "How can I believe that? How can I believe anything you've told me?" Vincent put his glass on the table and approached her. "Because everything I said about my feelings for you is true. Because for the first time in my life, I found someone who makes me want to be better than I am." Isabella stopped pacing and stared at him. "And what happened today? Why am I in danger?" "There was a territorial dispute with a rival family. They might try to use you to pressure me. But I won't let that happen," said Vincent, his voice loaded with determination. "You're safe here. I have men watching the building." Isabella sat heavily on the sofa, trying to process everything. The man she was falling in love with was part of organized crime. Her life had become a mafia movie. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course," agreed Vincent. "But Isabella, please, don't judge me only by what I do. Judge me by the man I am when I'm with you." They spent the next 3 days in the safe apartment. Vincent had canceled all his appointments to stay with her. And slowly, Isabella began to see beyond the shocking revelation. She saw how he treated the building staff with respect, how he genuinely cared about her well-being, how his eyes lit up when she smiled. It was on Thursday that Isabella began to feel strange. She was in the kitchen making coffee when a wave of nausea hit her. She ran to the bathroom and vomited, leaving Vincent worried. "It must be stress," she said, trying to convince herself. "All of this has been very intense." But when the nausea continued the next day, accompanied by strange breast tenderness, Isabella began to suspect something impossible. "Vincent," she said on Friday morning, "I need to go to the pharmacy." "Of course. Marco can go get whatever you need." "No," said Isabella, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to go personally." Vincent studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll go with you." At the pharmacy, Isabella bought 3 different pregnancy tests, her hands shaking as she paid. Vincent didn't ask questions, but she could feel his tension. Back at the apartment, Isabella locked herself in the bathroom. 3 minutes later, she was looking at 3 positive tests, her legs shaking so much she had to sit on the bathroom floor. "Isabella?" Vincent's voice came from the other side of the door. "Is everything okay?" She opened the door, the tests still in her hands. Vincent looked at them, then at her face, and she saw something she had never seen before in his eyes, pure joy mixed with amazement. Is this possible?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The doctor said it wasn't," said Isabella, tears beginning to fall. "They said the chances were less than 2%. Vincent pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "I told you miracles happen," he murmured in her ear. "I told you that when we find the right person, impossible things become possible." Isabella pulled back to look at him. "Vincent, I'm pregnant. Pregnant by a man I just discovered is part of the Mafia. My life has been turned upside down." "I know," he said, his hands gently touching her face. and I know this is scary. But Isabella, I love you, and I'll protect you and our baby with my life. How can I raise a child in this world? In your world? Vincent guided her to the sofa, sitting beside her. My world has dangers, that's true, but it also has protection, loyalty, family. Our child will never want for anything, will never be abandoned, will always have people willing to die for him. Isabella looked at the tests in her hands, still not quite believing it. I need to confirm with a doctor. Of course, agreed Vincent immediately. I know the best obstetrician in Chicago, Dr. Sarah Chen at Northwestern. She can see us today. How do you know the best obstetrician in Chicago? Asked Isabella, a suspicion growing in her mind. Vincent hesitated. I may have done some research after you told me about your condition. What kind of research? I wanted to better understand your situation. I wanted to know if there was anything that could be done. Isabella studied him. Vincent, what did you do? Nothing you wouldn't approve of, he said quickly. I just made sure you had access to the best medical care available. 2 hours later, they were in Dr. Chen's office, an Asian American woman in her 40s with a warm smile and reassuring manner. She confirmed what the tests had shown. Isabella was pregnant, approximately 5 weeks along. But doctor, said Isabella, I was diagnosed as sterile after a car accident. How is this possible? Doctor. Chen reviewed Isabella's previous tests, frowning. Sometimes the human body surprises us, she said finally. Although your tubes suffered damage, it appears one of them healed better than we expected. It's rare, but not impossible. What are the risks? Asked Vincent, holding Isabella's hand. Due to the medical history, we'll consider this a high-risk pregnancy, explained the doctor. We'll need to monitor closely, do regular tests, but I see no reason not to be optimistic. Leaving the office, Isabella felt like she was floating. She was pregnant. Against all odds, against all medical predictions, she was carrying a life inside her. How do you feel? Asked Vincent as they walked to the car. Scared, admitted Isabella. Happy, confused, everything at once. Vincent stopped and turned her to face him. Isabella, I know my life is complicated. I know it's not what you planned. But I promise you, I promise by everything that's sacred, that I'll do everything in my power to be the best man, the best father I can be. Isabella looked into his eyes and saw absolute sincerity. And I promise I'll try to understand your world, accept who you are. Because this baby deserves to have both parents. Vincent kissed her right there on the sidewalk, a kiss full of promise and hope. People passed by them, Chicago life continued around them, but for Isabella and Vincent, the world had stopped. They didn't know this would be just the first of 4 miracles. They didn't know that in the coming years, Isabella would defy all medical expectations, giving Vincent not just 1 child, but 4. And they certainly didn't know that each pregnancy would bring its own challenges, its own dangers, and its own moments of pure joy. But in that moment on the sidewalk in front of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, they had everything they needed: love, hope, and the promise of a family that no one had thought possible. 8 years later, the September morning sun filtered through the silk curtains of the master bedroom in the Romano mansion in Lake Forest, an exclusive suburb north of Chicago. Isabella woke slowly, feeling the familiar weight of a 7-month pregnant belly. Her 4th pregnancy in 8 years, each one a miracle that defied the original medical predictions. And beside her, Vincent was already awake, as always, checking messages on his phone. At 43, he had become even more imposing, with some gray streaks at his temples that only accentuated his natural authority. But when he looked at Isabella, his eyes softened with the same tenderness she had seen that first night at Rossi's. "Good morning, my beautiful," he murmured, kissing her forehead. "How are you two feeling today?" Isabella smiled, caressing her belly. "She's restless today. I think she's going to be like her siblings, full of energy." From the hallway, they could hear the sound of small footsteps running and children's voices in animated discussion. Vincent sighed dramatically. And speaking of the siblings, the bedroom door burst open and 3 children rushed into the room. Marco, 7 years old, led the invasion with his messy, dark hair and determined eyes that were an exact copy of his father's. Behind him came the 5-year-old twins, Sophia and Lucia, with Isabella's curly brown hair and the same mischievous expression. "Daddy! Mommy!" shouted Marco, jumping on the bed. "Nonna is making pancakes and said we can help." "But Marco wants to break all the eggs," complained Sophia, crossing her small arms. "Because I'm the oldest," protested Marco. "Only by 2 years," retorted Lucia, always defending her twin sister. Vincent laughed, pulling all 3 children into a collective hug. "How about if everyone helps Nonna, but each one with a different task?" Isabella watched the scene with a full heart. 8 years ago, when she received the devastating diagnosis of sterility, she could never have imagined this moment. Waking up in a house full of children's laughter, carrying her 4th child, married to a man who loved her unconditionally. The wedding had happened when she was pregnant with Marco. A small, intimate ceremony at the Church of Santa Maria Addolorata, in the heart of Little Italy, with only the families present. Isabella had insisted on keeping her surname professionally, but at home, she was proudly Isabella Romano. "Come on, children," said Vincent, getting up from bed. "Let Mommy rest a little more while you help Nonna with breakfast." After the children left, Isabella settled more comfortably in bed, reflecting on how her life had changed. The transition to Vincent's world hadn't been easy. In the first years, she struggled to reconcile her work as a nurse with the realities of being the wife of a Mafia boss. It had been difficult to accept that Vincent sometimes needed to travel suddenly, that armed men discreetly watched their house, that certain questions couldn't be asked. But she had also discovered that Vincent's world wasn't the violent stereotype she had imagined. It was a complex community with its own codes of honor, where family was sacred and loyalty was everything. Isabella had stopped working as a nurse after the twins' birth, but hadn't completely abandoned her passion for helping others. Instead, she had established a free clinic in Pilsen, her old neighborhood, discreetly financed by Vincent's organization. The clinic served immigrant families who didn't have access to adequate medical care, and Isabella personally supervised the care. "What are you thinking about?" asked Vincent, returning to the room with a cup of ginger tea for her. "About how we got here," replied Isabella, gratefully accepting the tea. "Sometimes it still seems surreal." Vincent sat on the edge of the bed, his hand finding her belly. "4 miracles," he said softly. "The doctors still can't fully explain it." It was true. Each pregnancy had surprised the specialists. After Marco, Dr. Chen had said the chances of a second pregnancy were even lower. But 2 years later, Isabella discovered she was expecting twins. And now, 3 years after Sophia and Lucia's birth, she was pregnant again. "Dr. Chen said yesterday that this might be the last," said Isabella, her voice loaded with mixed emotion. "My body has been through a lot, and at 36, 4 children is more than we ever dreamed," said Vincent, kissing her hand. "If this is the last, then we're blessed beyond any measure." They were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. "Avanti!" called Vincent. Maria Romano, Vincent's mother, entered the room. At 68, she was still a force of nature, a small but formidable woman who had become the most devoted grandmother the children could wish for. She had welcomed Isabella into the family with open arms, teaching her traditional Italian recipes and family secrets passed down through generations. "Vincent, you have an important call," she said in English with an Italian accent. "And Isabella, cara mia, the children are asking if they can make cookies after the pancakes." Isabella laughed. "Of course, Nonna, but only if they promise not to cover the entire kitchen with flour like last time." After Vincent left to take the call, Maria sat on the bed next to Isabella. "How are you feeling, dear?" "Really?" Isabella considered the question. Maria had become more than a mother-in-law. She was a confidant, a second mother. "Sometimes I feel overwhelmed," admitted Isabella. 4 children, Vincent's world, the responsibilities. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm strong enough for all of this." Maria took her hand. "My dear Isabella, you are the strongest woman I know. You brought light into my son's life, gave him a family he never thought he could have. And these children, they are your greatest achievement. But what if something happens to Vincent? What if his world catches up with us? It was a fear Isabella carried constantly. Although Vincent was careful, although his organization was more focused on legitimate business in recent years, there were always risks. There was always the possibility that enemies would try to reach him through his family. "Vincent will protect you with his life," said Maria firmly. "And if something happens, you won't be alone. You have a family now, Isabella. A family that will never abandon you." Later that day, Isabella was on the back porch, watching the children play in the expansive yard. Marco was teaching the twins to play baseball, his patience with his sisters reminding her of Vincent. Sophia was determined to hit the ball, while Lucia preferred to pick flowers to make bouquets. Vincent joined her, wrapping her from behind with his arms. "Penny, for your thoughts?" "I was thinking about how different they are," said Isabella, watching her daughters. "Sophia is determined, competitive. Lucia is gentle, artistic, and Marco, he has your natural leadership." "And our little princess?" asked Vincent, caressing her belly. "She's going to be special too," said Isabella. "They all are." That night after the children went to bed, Isabella and Vincent sat in his home office. The walls were lined with books, and there were family photos everywhere. Moments captured over the years that told the story of their unlikely love. "Isabella," said Vincent, his voice serious, "I need to talk to you about something." She turned to face him, recognizing the tone. "What happened?" "Nothing happened," he said quickly. "But I'm considering gradually stepping back from the business, passing more responsibilities to my lieutenants, focusing more on the family." Isabella felt her heart accelerate. "Why? Is something wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, it's right," said Vincent, taking her hands. "I'm 43 years old, Isabella. I have a wife I love, 4 children who are my life. I want to be present for every moment. I want to be the father I always wanted to have." Tears formed in Isabella's eyes. "Are you sure? I know how much the family, the organization means to you." "You and the children mean more," said Vincent simply. "They always have." 2 months later, on a cold November morning, Isabella gave birth to her 4th daughter. Valentina Romano came into the world weighing 7.5 pounds, with a powerful pair of lungs and dark hair that promised to be as rebellious as her siblings. When Vincent held his daughter for the first time, Isabella saw tears in his eyes, something rare for a man who had learned to hide his emotions since childhood. "She's perfect," he murmured, his voice choked. "They all are," agreed Isabella, watching Marco and the twins cautiously approach to meet their youngest sister. "She's so small," whispered Sophia, gently touching the baby's hand. "We're going to protect her," declared Marco with the seriousness of his 7 years. "And teach her everything we know," added Lucia. Isabella looked around the hospital room, Vincent holding Valentina, the 3 older children fascinated by their sister, Maria crying with joy in the corner. This was her family. Unlikely, complex, but absolutely perfect. 8 years ago, when she received the devastating diagnosis of sterility, Isabella could never have imagined this moment. 4 healthy children, a husband who adored her, and a life full of love and purpose. "You know what's funny?" she said to Vincent as he placed Valentina back in her arms. "What?" "The doctor said I could never have children, that the chances were less than 2%. Vincent smiled, kissing her forehead. "And I said miracles happen when we find the right person." 4 miracles, corrected Isabella, looking at each of her children. 5, said Vincent softly. Isabella looked at him questioningly. "You," he explained. "You were my first miracle. Everything else was just a consequence of finding you." As the family settled in for the first night with Valentina, Isabella reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here. She had started as a single nurse with a devastating medical diagnosis, and now she was the mother of 4 children, wife of one of Chicago's most powerful men, and a woman who had found her purpose not only in her own family, but in helping other families through her clinic. Vincent's world still had its dangers and complexities. There would always be men discreetly watching their house. There would always be aspects of his life she preferred not to know in detail. But she had learned that true love wasn't about finding someone perfect. It was about finding someone whose imperfections fit perfectly with yours. In the years that followed, the Romano family would become a legend in Chicago. Vincent gradually stepped away from the more dangerous aspects of his business, focusing on legitimate investments and discreet philanthropy. Isabella expanded her clinic, eventually opening 3 different locations in underserved neighborhoods of the city. Marco grew up to be a natural young leader, following his father's footsteps in terms of charisma and determination, but choosing the path of medicine inspired by his mother. Sofia became a talented athlete, competing in tennis at the national level, while Lucia developed an extraordinary talent for art, her paintings eventually being exhibited in Chicago galleries. And Valentina, the youngest, grew up to be exactly what her arrival had represented, a symbol that miracles really do happen, that love can overcome any obstacle, and that sometimes the most unlikely families are the strongest. But on that first night in the hospital, with Valentina sleeping peacefully in her arms and her family gathered around, Isabella simply allowed herself to feel gratitude. Gratitude for every difficult moment that had led her there, for every decision she had made, for every chance she had decided to take. "I love you," she whispered to Vincent as the children finally fell asleep in the hospital chairs. "I love you more," he replied, as he always did. "Impossible," said Isabella, smiling. "Nothing is impossible," said Vincent, looking at his 4 daughters. "You taught me that." And as snow began to fall softly over Chicago, covering the city with a white blanket of infinite possibilities, the Romano family slept together for the first time as a family of 6. A family that had defied all odds, overcome all obstacles, and proven that sometimes the happiest endings come from the most unlikely stories. Isabella Martinez had entered this journey as a broken woman, convinced that her dreams of motherhood were lost forever. She ended it as Isabella Romano, mother of 4 miracles, wife of a man who would move mountains for her, and a woman who had learned that true love doesn't just heal, it transforms, it transcends, and it makes the impossible possible. The story of Isabella and Vincent would become a legend whispered in the corridors of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where nurses still told about the patient who defied all medical diagnoses. It would be remembered in the streets of Little Italy, where a young Mexican-American nurse became the respected matriarch of one of the city's most powerful families. But most importantly, it would be remembered by 4 children who would grow up knowing they were conceived in love, born of miracles, and raised in a family where nothing, absolutely nothing, was impossible when you had enough love to make it reality. And so ends the extraordinary story of Isabella Martinez Romano, the woman who was declared sterile, but who became a mother of 4 children through the transforming power of true love, proving that sometimes the greatest miracles come disguised as the greatest challenges, and that destiny has a mysterious way of leading us exactly where we need to be.